he was in some ways much more of a militant in the streets type of person, throughout this, and continued with Radio Alicia, the anti-psychiatry movements, and also, was very involved in armed struggle in his way during the 1970s still, and very, very close to many of the militant groups around the world, including very close friends with Lula in Brazil. They were very close friends during this period. And as I mentioned to you last time, Lazzarato and some others, Eric Aliez, were all students of Deleuze on the other side. So the Italian group, around Negre and Tronti in the beginning, were educated somewhat by Deleuze in the early 70s, just again to situate it. So anyway, let me just read you one second, just this little thing. Felix's office at home was cluttered with an immense mess of papers and books piled all over. He told me he and Deleuze had written Anti-Oedipus in that house. This was the house at the clinic, right? Starting every morning by catching the first idea that happened to fly around, never stopping until sundown, and rarely revising or correcting it all, following the flow of the day. Right. One day, Deleuze's daughter came with friends to visit. Right. Anyway, this was a paragraph about how they operated. In the morning, they would have an idea. They would work with it all day till sundown. They never cared about revising or correcting. This was very much later. And then he does say, I want to just read a couple of other things. This is very beautiful, personal about Guattari. Felix and Josephine, his wife, once came to stay with me in my loft in New York and so on. My wife couldn't believe the storm that hit us. Someone who had known him asked later how he could have ever survived it. Josephine played rock and roll records often and loud. Felix consumed an interesting number of bathroom towels, which then disappeared. We found a pile of them under their bed after they left. He conducted long, smoky sessions with his friends and translators until very late at night, and they were working on cracks in the street, I guess on ruptures and fissures, right? A text on Balthus, the painter, who was actually Pierre Kloskowski's brother-in-law, by the way, the great Nietzschean scholar and translator of Heidegger, and which I eventually edited and published in New Observations. So we would talk until we both happened to cross paths in the apartment, both steeped as we were in our innate tendency to ebulliently stuff too much activity in every hour of our lives. And during one family meal, there was discussion about religion in which some bigoted opinions were voiced, and I was surprised how nurturing and tolerant Felix proved to be in his responses. So anyway, I'm going to try to get this for you. This is very beautiful. I don't want to read the whole thing, but just to give you an idea, the title is called The Time Queen by Lucio Pazzi, a well-known Soho artist who I think may still be alive, or I'll check on that. I haven't seen him in years, but I met with him several times on this piece. So yeah, really a great guy. Anyway, this is interesting. I don't know if you can see this, but this is how Felix Guattari saw the labyrinth of the mind. I don't know if this is visible to you, but this was a drawing of his during the time as well. And I have a little small one of his. Unfortunately, it's locked in a closet in Montreal, like a lot of other things. But anyway, I would show you one of the originals. So, but anyway, a very labyrinthian structure. You really probably can't see the detail so well here, but I wanted you to know. Anyway, very interesting. Again, going back over this. This was done 20-something years ago at the time of his death. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit before we get started into the text. Again, one way of reading this text, and Chris Knight knows this text fairly well, and I think I would say Josepha too knows it well, that one way of reading this text is to think of it as a kind of work of extreme abstract art, right? And that we're following along linear and multilinear paths in this way. And I will put up again on the weekend the notion. I'll try to describe this for you: the connective, conjunctive, and disjunctive synthesis, because they're dealing with a kind of Kantian moment here in terms of the synthetic ground, but it's actually different because of the conjunctions, connective, conjunctive synthesis. So there's the and always is working, if you want to try to read it this way, as really a work of art. Again, the more I read it, the more I see interspersed is the literature behind this. It's amazing. Antonin Artaud, of course, Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence, Malcolm Lowry, Buchner, Heine, Kleist, all of these figures who were really against state thinking, who were setting up in Deleuze and Guattari's notion, the minor literature or the war machine against the dominant order, right? This was always already going on, a kind of decoding and a deterritorialization, if you will, through literature and art. So they're and it's not all frown. They have great admiration. Deleuze really loved American literature. He wrote on Herman Melville, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. He wrote a short piece on Melville as well. And of course, they were both impressed with the Henry Miller trilogies, and they were also very impressed by D.H. Lawrence in England. You can see he mentions, I think, Lawrence in this section on love and love objects. And again, the literature and the poetics is always already operative here. They're listening to something outside. In fact, they take Freud's statement, before the poets, we must lay down our arms. They take that very literally, I think, and filmmakers, of course, too. And I recommend highly, if you're interested in this stuff beyond, what we're doing here, the work of Deleuze on cinema is very, very important work on movement, image, and movement time, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. But the two filmmakers that come most to my mind related to Deleuze are Jean-Pierre Melville, again, another great figure of the French resistance, who changed his name to Melville, by the way, because of Herman Melville when he escaped. Really? Yeah. Nazi, he went to London and he changed his name. He was Jewish, changed his name to Jean-Pierre, and he kept it his whole life. A pretty amazing filmmaker. The Silence of the Sea is one of the great films of all time about Nazi. I'm kind of into the actress. Stéphane Nicole is amazing. Nicole Stéphane, excuse me. She's amazing in this role, and I saw her in another film too that anticipates. If you've seen Bertolucci's film on post-1968, The Dreamers. I don't know if you know that, but it's elementary Melville. Melville did it much better with Enfants Terribles, 40, 50 years before Bertolucci tried his hand at May of 68. So that's one filmmaker. And of course, Godard, especially the Godard of the period of the 60s, from the period, I would say, from Weekend through La Chinoise to the experiments with Goran later in that period. So this is tremendous cinema influences here going on. So again, I just emphasize, I know it's a very dense reading. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, to put it mildly. Deleuze once said about the stock market, and I always love this, and Chris and Steve will appreciate that, or the people that are interested in finance capital. The stock market is the rationality of the irrational. Right? This was Deleuze's statement on what the stock exchange does today. So irrational exuberance, is really taking it, the Schiller, whatever it was, the economist's, notion of this after the .com bust, right, is kind of well taken. Deleuze said it much earlier than he did, the rationality of irrationality. But again, the work is this way. So anyway, I would like, if you, I mean, I'm sure you have questions or thoughts on this. I thought last week was very good in terms of the people's interest in this and maybe what we could do with it. I want to say one of the projects for me personally is that, in the Institute for Radical Imagination, we've been trying to develop a curriculum. And to me, this is one of the founding books, if you will, towards a materialist psychiatry or towards a materialist psychology, if you will. There are many people involved in this, but I think this book is one of the starting points for that going forward, and I see this as a kind of, as I mentioned last week, a kind of prolegomena to the philosophy of where we are of the postmodern, with 1,000 plateaus maybe being the first philosophy, even though, again, another work in which is so fragmented to our, quote, traditionally constructed logical minds, if we still have those, as we move into the pandemic. But I still think that this is very reflective of our times in terms of new principles, neologisms, and new languages we can use. Especially the language of singularity that Bruno likes a lot, the language of the sujet, the subject. I think it opens up these spaces, right, for this new kind of thinking that goes well beyond the traditional post-World War II existential Marxism of Sartre and Kojève, preceding them, which ended up in a kind of philosophical anthropology. And it certainly exceeds the structuralist project, in which set up a kind of totalitarian order system of almost anything that was fed could be fed back to a structure, right, in a way, even though I love Levi-Strauss with all due respect, there is this tyrannical feedback system that the structure always will hold, and you will be able to put it in the history of myths, structural studies of myths. And so anyway, I want to kind of begin with this, this notion of delirium, and then we can maybe work backwards to this chapter. So the reading today will go from the materialist psychiatry, beginning on page 22, but I want to mention a couple of things before that, and then we go back to desiring and desiring nothing. Okay, Hugo, what's your question? I'm sorry, you can raise your hand. I don't see you, but I see you in the chat. Yeah.
I just typed in that I remain puzzled about the use of the term machines,
right,
in the text. I'm not quite sure I'm understanding how it's being used. So I'm interested in your comment on what is this use of the term machines, and I'm thinking, is it related to the unconscious being a factory? Is it?
I knew you would ask for that, so I wrote out something that
some kind of Cartesian, post-Cartesian thing. Because,
well, I'm not so sure it's Cartesian, but I mean, they're obviously very influenced by the Cartesian moment. It's very hard to, get away from that if you're educated in France, right? There's residue, right? This goes on at age 13, and in France, in the schools. But anyway, let me go to what you're referring to. The word machine, and I was going to put this up on the website, is used in a literal, not a metaphorical sense, right? It's literal to them, right? It's understood, if you will, as a central characteristic of desire. So we have to presuppose, if you will, this is a work about desire. It's Anti-Oedipus or desire and desiring machines, right? But desire is first, right? It should not be reduced to any kind of mechanism, right? It's not a closed process within a technological machine or any kind of specific organization that the human being has, to organize action that has an end in mind. Okay, so it's literally a machine, right? In some sense. Desire as a machine is a multiplicity, if you will, of desiring machine, right? The desiring machine. So desire, again, is presupposed as a machine, right? it comes in that way. So machine is being used literally, not in the mechanistic sense, but the body as machine, right? What happens to the paranoiac is that the body, loses its notion of the machine, right? It becomes this paranoiac activity, and they speak to this in a way. So I think it's going to come as we go further into this. And then the idea here is, in terms of desiring machines, is that he's really looking at a kind of synthesis early on that, the desiring production and the desiring machine itself is the fundamental synthesis, if you will, between the psychoanalytic, if you will, or the question of desire, and that of the Marxist notion of production. Okay, so this becomes almost a synthetic connective term that they're using here, if that makes sense to you, right? So this is where the desiring machine comes from. It's a production, it's a production, we are really looking here, and again, philosophically, this is very dense in the sense that you have Deleuze, the Spinozist, and the Nietzschean speaking with the militant Marxist analyst, right? Who is going on the way of the molecular biological region, right? So you have these kind of cross paths that are sort of connecting and intersecting throughout. Okay, so Spinoza's, natura naturam, or homo, man as nature, right? As we're part of nature, which is a very elementary principle in Marx. People forget this because they're always interested in labor capital relations, but Marx always considered us part of nature. In a way. And also the question of phenomenology is at stake here too. Is consciousness a materiality, or is it something that desiring production and desiring machines overcome, right? Consciousness remains in this idealist position, if you will, not a materialist position, right? Okay, so I don't know if that's helping, but I'm trying to, navigate through a very dense situation. But think of this, they begin with, what a mistake to call it id, right? The unconscious, the thatness. They want to call it it, right? A machine, right? Just a machine, right? Yeah, and they're trying
Michael,
to get out of this. Yes, yeah.
Just the notion of drive could be helpful with that, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, of course. Yeah, I was going to go there. Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Lydia. I mean, sure. Yeah.
Yes, just that the drive is a little bit complex. People think of it as the sort of bodily energy, but the Freudian concept is actually, it's akin to will in some ways, and in another way, it's akin to the force of attraction with an object. So, and yet not limiting the force to that object. It alleges itself to be without object,
right?
But the cathexis belies that. So there's a kind of complexity. The demand upon the demand that on the is it the mind and the body to do the work, right? So it's a demand for work, and it's kind of a compromise formation already, in as much as it's what keeps everything about the body and the organizing principles of the mind going.
Okay, I mean, that's a good description of the drive. Let me just mention a couple of things about Deleuze in particular in this relationship, in this dialogue, called, I mean, if dialogue, this kind of, attempted connected synthesis between him and Felix. Okay, so think of it this way: desire, and I think Freud gets this from Nietzsche too, is really Nietzsche's will to power for Deleuze. It's a will to power. This is really the background here, right? So you have the will to power that meets conatas, the force for self-preservation in Spinoza. These two moments very strongly are coming together, right? So the fundamental principle of ontology, of being, operates through us as power, as human beings. And I've talked a little bit about this. Again, for me, if you do an ontology of the quote so-called modern unholy trinity, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, you think of Marx's ontology of that of value, right? That Marx puts into question value. This is what he does in terms of capitalism, if you really think about this philosophically and ontologically. In of course, Freud's question is, as desire, right? As desire, right? And this move for pleasure. So for some reason, Deleuze and Guattari are not interested in desire as pleasure seeking, but desire itself is this will to power, Nietzschean, that Nietzsche's notion of ontology is the will to power that is constantly in the process of becoming. So we're always becoming intensive, becoming something other, if you will. We're always, and you mentioned this very well in the drive, and I think Freud in his more, in the Project for Scientific Psychology, as well as later in, some of the lectures given at Clark University, and when he describes the drive and speaks of drive and drive theory, is really talking about the play of forces within the drive too. Drive as a play of forces. So
it's not actually pleasure seeking, it's tension reducing.
Right. Well, towards homeostasis, right? I mean, this is really the goal always. For them, that is not the goal of desiring machines. It's not goal directed ever. It's not about releasing. It's more about preservation, right? It's about it's a see. I'll read you. I mean, I took a quote from Nietzsche's Will to Power, which may give us better insight into this in a poetic way. It's as the unconscious sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing and literally flooding back and eternally flooding back. So this is the Nietzschean moment in this, in a sense. It's never conscious and it's never anthropomorphic. So the goal of psychoanalysis to make us conscious of our everyday misery and giving us tools, if you will, this was the original goal of at least the forebearer, our forefathers of psychoanalysis, was to make everyday misery a little more bearable, etc., and make conscious of what was unconscious, the famous Freudian dictum where it was, I shall become, vor es war, ich werden in German. So this is not where they're going, right? They want to stay out of this. What a mistake to call it id or unconscious in a certain way. This is to go back to where Hugo began, this machinaic, if you will. And this, of course, I know Richard's been reading the text in French. Maybe he can, contextualize the notion of machinaic in French in the text, because we have this English limitation, based on what they're playing on in the language. But anyway, the desiring machine is an attempt to go beyond this notion of making the unconscious conscious, right? In a sense. It's really looking at a different kind of just will to power, if you will. Yeah.
Michael, I just want to intervene about Freud and say that that's a really the idea that the end product of ego is, as you say, but there's so much more to it.
No, I know that. I'm
right. So that's a real simplification.
Yeah. I'm not trying to put him down that way. That's not.
What I mean to say is just that the notion of a desiring machine seems completely and adequately Freudian, and Freud does seem to be in the philosophical inheritance of this other dynamic of will, in the confusion or conflation of both generative primordiality and directionality in flows. So there's contradictions even in Freud's own development of thinking, spatially, functionally, orientedly, but among all of these things, these flows, of desire. That's it. Just that
Okay,
I read.
fair enough. And where we begin here is with the topography, and that's true in a sense, right? That's true in terms of the topography. They're taking on that economic topography that Freud sets up, right? That's where they're going. They think it's a mistake to have called it the id, right? That's where they begin. You know, they're really looking at the machine. You know, this is where they begin. In a poetic way. Yes, Carl, and then Bruno.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, Lydia, could you say again, did you say that the desiring machine is, in your understanding, a very Freudian concept or not? I just
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
it is a very Freudian.
It seems that way to me, and it seems to me that they're departing from Lacan, not from Freud.
Hmm. And just I thought that was interesting, the way they define desire not as lack.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. I just the thing I wanted to just see if other people sort of had this impression is I felt like this idea of machine was, you know, like the body has many machines within it, and that those machines can join with other machines, and that there are these, I guess, these, you know, what later became assemblages, and that what constitutes a machine is not really like me as a machine. It's like my desire machines can join with yours, which can join, you know, and there's these flows, and it's not really inside any subject.
Exactly. So against the subject,
that's how I read it.
The cathexis is the connection of the drive to other objects or part objects. So that seems to be what's part of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. And the machine could become, you could look at like an organ, you know, inside the body as a machine, or a machine could become something far more complex. You know, that there's not like a clear boundary, that there's a discrete desiring machine. That's how I
there's no boundary here for them.
Right. Well,
there's no limit in the
flows,
machine.
right?
Yeah.
There are flows.
Yeah. There always flows. Yes.
It's a pre-Oedipal situation.
Yeah.
Well, it may be a bypassing of the Oedipal completely. I mean, in some ways, because they'll go back and talk about, if you've read Fanon says, you know, the problem with, you know, the Western psychoanalytic tradition is we have many African tribes where there's nothing but short circuits, and we don't have the daddy, mommy, me triangulation, and we don't have Oedipus as a signifier, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's one thing that's going on here too, underneath the, you know, again, they don't explicitly say it, but remember, it's written after the Algerian, the liberation, after many of the Black Revolution. They'll speak about later, what form will this take in the unconscious? Will it be George Jackson, you know, who's about lines of flight, you know, the choosing of new weapons. So there's a very different approach here than to the standard psychoanalytic model. That's all I'm saying. You know, I'm not disagreeing with you about how Freud, you know, conceptualized drives very, you know, very adequately. And in my opinion, if you read Nietzsche under the surface, you can make a strong case for, you know, Freud is, in some ways systematically takes Nietzsche's great insights up to his madness and you know, organizes it into a psychic organization, the will.
Absolutely. I'm just going to push back upon characterizations of standard psychoanalytic readings. Mostly they're wrong. Mostly they're just inaccurate.
Okay. I mean, what I think they're trying to avoid, I just want to say this again, is this whole notion of the family romance once again, right? And how do we get out of this narrative of the family romance in many ways, right? This is another thing that they seem to be dealing with going forward. Vis-a-vis psychoanalysis. With Marx, it's something else. Again, this is an attempted synthesis. It's not really, it's as much Marx as it's Freud, you know, that is at stake here. And of course, like I said, it's Nietzsche and Wilhelm Reich that seem to provide much of the ammunition, you know, going forward, right? And Reich, you know, did not, stay with drive theory in terms of his break with the movement. So I think we have to be careful, you know, here too, you know, because I think if we read all, you know, we're going to miss something in terms of what they're trying to do. If we just, you know, impose upon them, you know, what they're doing vis-a-vis certain traditional things. I think they're trying to get it out. You know, they're trying to say, look, there's a dynamic play of forces. That's certainly in Freudian drive theory. But at the same time, the will to power is always to become more, and it doesn't strive for pleasure or the reduction of tension. It is really about the power of self-preservation, which is a much more of a Spinozaist idea of conatus, right? As well as, you know, how you know, people actually react in the world. And again, they're going to really try. I mean, one of the reasons I want to read this book is, again, we have this uprising of fascist desire. And on the other hand, we have this kind of moment, if you will, of where the fascist desire that plays out in everyday life is confronted by the worst bad faith of all, which is the liberal desire. You know, let's put this out. We're going to take the minimum wage part out of the bill on the new CARES Act. We'll never address any kind of systemic problems, nothing but bad faith in terms of what's going on right now. The question is, how do we get to this point? How do we overcome this very interesting proposition that goes back to on voluntary servitude, which is being studied by some other people, and we did a course on it in Techniques of Servitude. How do we get out of this? I just want to, you know, read you one section of this book that I think is absolutely crucial in terms of its ethics. And as I said last week, I read it as an ethics. You know, this is on page 26, 27. Let me see where it is exactly. Yeah, it's on page 29. Even the most repressive and most deadly forms of social reproduction are produced by desire within the organization that is the consequence of such production under various conditions that we must analyze. That is why the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely the one that Spinoza saw so clearly and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? This, to me, again, is the fundamental question of our time, really, to be honest. Why is the fight, the struggle, always for servitude rather than for freedom? I don't like the word salvation, but anyway,
But you know,
maybe redemption
the
would be
answer.
better, or recognition. Yeah, anyway, okay.
Did you know the answer to that?
Okay.
You know the answer to that.
We do?
People
Okay,
don't want to be
I want
responsible.
to know. Then I can say we had a good semester and cut it off in 1.5 sessions. Yeah, please. Yeah. What is the answer to that?
You know, it's a classic question since I started political science, studying political science decades ago. Why do people always vote against their long-term best interest?
Well, that's
which
the
they
vote.
always do.
But that's just the vote.
I'll send you a very interesting book.
Okay, I look forward to that. And we know there are 3 great.
I will send it.
Again, I hate to do this, but
I'll find it.
3 texts of Freud, 3 texts of why not vote, why vote. One being, of course, Gramsci in The New Order in 1919. The second one, W.E.B. Du Bois during the Eisenhower-Stevenson election, when he said, we don't vote, and Jean-Paul Sartre after May of '68, election trap for fools. So this is a very interesting thing around this notion of the voting and electoral process. But anyway, look at this. How can people possibly teach or reach the point of shouting, more taxes, less bread? And this is what we're getting. Who's going to be handed the bill on all these CARES Acts? You think this is going to go to the top? Think about it. You know, the $1,400 extra payment, you know, and now they're upping the thing. Okay, as Reich remarks, the astonishing thing, and Brecht said this too in a different way, is that most people, it's not that some people steal and others occasionally go out on strike, but rather that all those who are starving do not steal as a regular practice, right? And all those who were exploited and not continually out on strike after centuries of exploitation Why do people still tolerate being humiliated and enslaved to such a point, indeed, that they are actually want humiliation, going back, even though it's a contract. Chris can explicate this a bit with Venus in furs, sans or massage, and slavery, not only for others, but for themselves. Reich is at its best. And I think this is one of the crux of the problem of the book, and what they're trying to, get around and short circuit, if you will, to really short circuit something here. Reich, what Carl was saying about the machines, it's not just us as machine, right? Or the subject as machine. It's connecting machines that are really at stake. Is as profound as a thinker when he refuses to accept ignorance, like Chomsky. If we know something, we're going to change it. That's the Chomskyan position in politics. Or illusion on the part, false consciousness. Joseph Goebbels, the great thinker of the time, on the part of the masses as an explanation of fascism. Only if people knew. This is really this thing, and demands an explanation will take their desires into account, an explanation formulated in terms of desire under a certain set of conditions. They wanted fascism, and it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. Yep. So this is I think a fundamental part of this book of what a materialist psychiatry still has not really answered, or still has not problematized in the right way, right? In a sense. I mean, why do we have so much of this cancel culture? Every time anybody does something that is bad, they're going to go after them, look at this thing with Cuomo. I'm not for Cuomo, being in power, but who's going to effectively run things at this point after he has done so at this point? This is like, a Kristen Gillibrand going after Al Franken. We lost Al Franken, someone who could do some good in the Senate. This is all about, a kind of perversion of desire that doesn't really see the long term. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but to me, it seems to fit into this culture of humiliation, and then kind of this unconscious, if you will, or, unwittingly playing into the slavery of the time, right? So Reich himself, I'm going down the page here because I think this is a very crucial section beyond what is, the machine and what is the desiring machine. This is a very important part of this book. Reich himself never manages to provide a satisfactory explanation because at a certain point, he reintroduces the line of argument that he was in the process of demolishing by creating a distinction. And this, I think this is important to Deleuze and Guattari, by creating a distinction between rationality as it is or ought to be in the process of social production. The way rationality should be and should not be, and the irrational element in desire, and by regarding only the latter as a suitable subject for psychoanalytic investigation. Hence, the sole task that he assigns psychoanalysis is the explanation of the negative, the explanation of the subjective, the inhibited within the social field. He therefore necessarily returns to a dualism between the real object rationally produced on one hand and the irrational fantasizing production on the other. He gives up trying to discover the common denominator or the coextension of the social field and desire. And again, going back to desiring machines as this kind of attempted synthesis and desire as production, right? And as will to power that, we're trying to get to as the social field and desire in order to establish the basis for a genuinely materialistic psychiatry. There was a category that Reich was sorely in need of, and that is of desiring production. So this is going to be their starting point, desiring production, which would apply to the real in both its so-called rational and irrational forms. So I don't know what you think about this, but to me, this is a very real question, in a way that they're posing here. It is an essential question. Why do we, even us very highly, sophisticated consciousnesses, right, in a way, or very sophisticated advanced minds, still in this process, see all this humiliation, enslavement, indebtedness, all of these things that have happened, especially during the last 40 years. You can look at this as a symptomatology of neoliberalism. Why does it go on, and why is it still happening today? You know, this to me is a very fundamental question. And how do we think this through their category, or maybe even go beyond their category of desiring production? Bruno, I know you were unmuted for a second. I didn't mean to go on, but I was kind of responding to, yeah.
No, it's okay. I mean, now it's in a sense past. I mean, it's still there, but in a sense, going back to what Carl was saying, and I agree with that. And the question of the subject, really, as well as what you mentioned, maybe we'll go back to the overlapping of the conjunctive and disjunctive synthesis, which is one of the most important points. But they do say that the subject is an appendix to the machine. So the machine is everything. Right. So the subject itself is marginal, right? I mean, if anything, the subject is missing and not desire in the subject, right? This is very, and they say that on at least two different, I can give on page 20 and then page 26, they speak about this in very important ways. But I also wanted to just share, you know, with everybody this, there is this wonderful little book by Gerard Raunig, right? A German philosopher.
Right?
Yeah, he also wrote a book, Dividuum, but this is 1,000 machines, in which he gives the etymology of a machine, and right from the Greek, the Latin, the Greek, the Indo-European roots, mag, which is really this expansive and constantly amplifying power, right? So which goes back to some of the things that you said, Michael, even with the will to power, not Nietzsche, and what Carl said. So, but just to you know, to share this, it's a very interesting notation, right? Because machine is usually, we think of machine as a thing, right? But of course, this the desiring machine is
right. It is not a thing, and it's not an object. That's the whole
right.
thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
We no longer have, and I know this is very difficult, because we think in terms of subject and object. We think in terms of, you know, objectification. We think this way. We're trained this way. But for Deleuze and Guattari, there's no distinction between man and world. Right? There's just world, right? The phenomenological moment of constituting world and all of this is breaking down completely. You know, this is from the outside always, as Bruno points out, right? Expansive, you know, and it opens up this notion, and we'll go there. Of course, again, I really hope we get the website going. I hope I fulfill the intention of putting out some of these terms, but we get to the terms of territorialization and deterritorialization and reterritorialization, which are very important for them in terms of their this movement, if you will, you know.
Michael, if I may, they also say there is no distinction between producing and the product.
That's correct. That's another thing. Even as consumers, right, there's not this distinction that we have in general market terms. We're always talking about consumer society. No, we're producing, right? This is, in some ways, it's an argument, you know, and Stiegler never really went there, but, you know, Stiegler, in terms of this emphasis upon the consumer society and consumerism, is really, in a way, against this kind of reading in some ways. This is all, we're always producing, you know, this is what they're saying. It's, you know, subject as production, right? Producing machines is probably a better way of doing it. It's no longer, you know, as the subject. So, of course, we are raised in the United States and in Europe, and maybe in a different way, to think in terms of individual versus society, you know, subject and object and all of this. They're trying to break down these binaries and these dichotomies and just say, no, there's world, there's nature, there's industry, and these distinctions and these separations aren't really happening, right? In a way.
Michael,
and really about more. Yeah, David. Yes, please.
Would it be right to say that the way that the subject sort of gets lost in here is that there's like there's machines connected to machines producing desire and producing the production of desire. And in all of that production, you would have to like freeze a moment in all of those processes to point at like a subject in the way that we think of subjects. And so like everything's in motion all the time. So there's no like static subject in the way that we would think of ourselves as individual subjects. We're just moments in this production of desire with like overlapping machines attaching to one another, producing different kinds of desire. And we all, even like as individuals collected here, are part of a larger machine producing different kinds of desires. And so like there's no moment of subjectivity as we would usually think of it in there. But I thought the connection to Marx that helps me think through like the desiring machine and machines generally how they're using it is the way that they speak to like the moment I think of like of fetishism, where they go through a passage. There's like a page and a half where they sort of begin with a quote from Marx and then end with a reference to fetishism. And I think they're saying that like the desiring machines are the sort of moments of production that are lost when all you see in capitalism is capital. So like insofar as finance capital is a fetish that hides all of the actual production behind it, that capital is a body without organs. And the desiring machines are like the actual production that takes place that like we don't have contact with if we see capital as simply self-reproducing. It's those desiring machines that we don't see when we see the self-reproduction of the capital as a body without organs. So like the Marxists, when they put that in Marxist terms, it made more sense to me, I guess, than when they're dealing in Freudian terms, because I'm more familiar with the Marxist stuff. I don't know. If that makes sense, then that's how it's making sense to me.
Yes, we're talking about.
Raise your hand though. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
If we're talking about being desiring machine, then I think we have to leave behind the notion of the subject, or at least think of the subject as nomadic, as porous, as filling in from one subjectivity to another. And we haven't lost anything if we are desiring machines. We've only lost the subject.
Yeah, okay. Eloy, you had your hand up? Yeah. Eloy? Yeah. I saw you had your hand up. Eloy? No? Oh, okay. Yes, Carl. Yes, please. Yeah.
So I just, two things. I would really like to talk more about the body without organs. Which I find
that's the fascination here, right?
But just reference for a moment the passage you read, Michael, because that jumped out at me also, and I just wanted to sort of flag something. I don't know if this is other people notice this or think this, but it's interesting how they're talking about how Reich has this separation between sort of the rationality of principles of social organization and the irrationality of the unconscious. That's kind of how I read it. And then they later go on, and I thought this was also kind of a core passage. It's 34 to 35. There's this paragraph.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah, I was going to go there, but please, yeah.
Yeah, well, what we are really trying to say, and then they talk about, capitalism is sort of this form of schizoid desire production.
Right.
And then they talk about, which I think they then link that to sort of a deterritorialized, decentered, subjectless process. And then it's constantly being sort of reordered and colonized and territorialized by law and the state. And I just thought this was very interesting because in a certain way, they're reintroducing a dichotomy. To me, in a certain sense, that they're sort of saying, well, the social field has these other principles of organization, but they're kind of being located in the state and law and administrative bureaucracy, etc. So I just thought that was interesting, and I'm interested to see how this develops over the course of the book, because it seems it was maybe.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to make one remark, about that. I mean, this section in some ways. I know that I put in what Deleuze and Guattari are engaging at some level are both the family and the state. They're axe to grind with psychoanalysis is the family made you sick, made you neurotic. You know, you're going to lay on the couch. The new family will make you well. So what psychoanalysis does, it re-territorializes in a certain way. It becomes very much like a new kind of bureaucracy for their minds. I'm not saying it always works that way, etc. But in a way, we have seen this with ego psychology, how it was used in the United States, and of course, you know, how it plays into you know, many things that we've encountered in our society, especially during the last 40 to 50 years, in my opinion, since the 60s. The other one is on state. The state, their problem with orthodox and, you know, reductionistic Marxism, if you will, is that the state has made you sick, capitalism has made you sick, and socialism somehow, or a socialist bureaucracy, will make you well. So again, they're looking at this from the standpoint of pathologies and re-territorialization. So they're always looking at this in terms of how desire is perverted, right? They're against this perversity of desire. One of the reasons they go to the schizoid is to get away from perverted desire that they see as part and parcel of the psychoanalytic moment, that the perversion is engaged not in a creative way, but, you know, it's just, you know, re-territorialized into the system. I don't know if this makes sense, but they're really against this kind of recodification, re-territorialization constantly throughout this. So to go back what Chris mentioned, the nomadic flows, right? And what you mentioned, Carl, this kind of short-circuiting of, you know, of machines, right? Into, you know, short-circuit the family dynamic into something else, right? In terms of the social field, you know, in a way, displacing Freud and the couch into Marx on a walk, right, about the social field. There's no such thing as subject, individual, subjectivity, etc. There's only the socius, right, that they're talking about. And this is also part of the body with organs. Jeff, why don't you go ahead? I see you have your hand up, and yeah, please comment, and we'll go back to where Carl located this in the text about the body.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to throw out there that, you know, when they were talking about, I think about machines, and you brought it up, and it's something I just recall coming across in a couple of Deleuze things from, you know, from like the early and mid 90s, that I think Manuel Delanda kind of picked up too, that I think might be a little helpful here, just as another little orbit. It is the notion of like, oh, hey, they stop and say, hey, by the way, we don't mean this as a metaphor. We mean this as, they're trying to like break out of the, you know, the sort of metaphorical nature of language. And like, you know, I think a lot of what we're talking about here already is that discussion, but sometimes they sort of pause and say that. And I think it's a good kind of reset or reminder, you know, that because I think it's sort of like almost sort of fundamental to that attempt to like make something like psychoanalysis materialist. So anyway, just something I've noticed over and over again over the years, related readings.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up something I think very crucial to the way they understand linguistics. One of their, again, the gripe is that the metaphoric and the metonymic that is involved in psychoanalysis is being displaced throughout here, right, in many ways, right?
The displaced one?
Yeah, I'm sorry?
The displaced one?
The displacement of the old metaphor and metonymy, you know, that axis in linguistic theory, that axis is being displaced through a Zelmselthian, and I'm sorry I don't have the book with me, but Louis Zelmselth is actually the linguist behind some of Deleuze's thinking, you know, outside the Saussurean sense of the language system and the utterance, as well as, you know, the metaphorics, you know, in Freud, the rule of metaphor is very, very important, right, in a sense. So they're really trying to get out of this as well. You know, this is another, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Jeff. This is very, very important to keep in mind. This is much more about the war machine, since you brought up Delanda. By the way, that was one of his first books, you know, War in the Age of intelligent machines. And, this is much more about, again, this encounter. I've been reading, by the way, Bateson again, this encounter with a very different kind of expressive language that really doesn't use metaphor or metonymy. This is a very modern work in this respect. This is a work that I'm beginning to sense is much more applicable to, what we're witnessing from Silicon Valley, what we're witnessing in finance capital today. This is very prophetic in some ways, if you extend it. I'm talking about a kind of almost extended logic here of where they're going, this kind of literalism, that they play. But please continue, Jeff. I see you still have your hand up and your mute off. Yeah.
Just a last quick thing too. Just another thought from the 90s, like starting to look at this stuff and now coming back to this. So it's exciting to me. Is I just remember seeing Peter Eisenman speak, who was just an architect from that time that considered himself a student of Derrida.
Yes. They were very,
just and a talk that he gave where, rather than just showcasing his work, like that's my background. I'm a landscape architect. So,
I got you.
just showcasing his work, he actually wanted to sort of leave us with something, right? And so it was this notion that, if architecture is really sort of like out of its league, even in the 90s, in terms of the symbolic, right? Because film is really just sort of at this much more advanced level in terms of a medium. And so that really for him, this statement that he made was just like, it should be approaching the genetic, right? And then, without really being able to say what that was at that point, it was just his thought of like, that's where it should be going. And, I think that was just another part of that same discourse, how to sort of like, like get out of the metaphorical metonymic nature of language. So
we'll go back to this because there's also an encounter here. I'll bring this back around, I hope. I mean, I hope, we can, have very fruitful discussions about what the attack is here is somewhat on the Lacanian symbolic order too, in a way. This is really another thing where the imaginary is privileged over the symbolic, and really the movement is between the real and the imaginary, very much like it is with Sartre. The symbolic isn't there as structure, as this very important part to the Lacanian field. So we can go there too, and I don't know how much, look, I don't want to go so far afield, but, one great exercise in this, in terms of understanding this metaphoric and metonymic, is to read the debate between Derrida and Lacan on Poe's Purloined Letter. One is taking the side of metaphor and the other, in some ways, is taking the side of metonymy. And it's interesting to see it framed this way. Yes, Chris. Yeah.
Where is that?
There's a book called The Purloined Letter, and I think both essays are there, the debate that they had. And Yale French Studies, I think, also had a thing on it. Yeah. So it's very interesting in terms of this thing about linguistics. In fact, maybe what I can do later, when we get there, I want to kind of ground this again today. I'm trying to keep with the ethical question, because I want to read a couple of passages here that are crucial. But, I'll go back to this whole thing of what linguists, and code and linguistic codes are operative in this work, of Deleuze and Guattari, and talk a little more about the anti-Saussureanism, the anti-Chomskyanism. I think I alluded to it last week a little bit, about that it's not a question of language as a differential system without positive terms, or the Chomskyan notion of the generative and grammar and transformative grammar, and the Cartesian linguistics of Chomsky. So, but yeah, we'll go back there. I just want to go back to Marx here in a sense, because I think David Winters is absolutely right. In some ways, this is a real shift to Marx, in a way, reading Freud. It is not an attempted synthesis. It's kind of the socius of Marx and the social field reading psychoanalysis. As most of you know, there were many attempts post-World War II to kind of reconcile, if you will, Marx and Freud in a synthetic moment, right? Of course, this begins with Erich Fromm, right, of the Frankfurt School, peripheral to the Frankfurt School. It also is in Marcuse's Eros in Civilization, an attempted Marxist-Freudian synthesis. It's also in a book that I admire deeply for its positioning of class struggle called Neurosis and Civilization, but it's called Neurosis, and I mentioned it, I think, last week, Neurosis and Civilization, a Marxist Freudian synthesis, and by Michael Schneider, a very interesting book that came out in the 70s. So there have been these attempts at many levels to kind of synthesize this. This, to me, is a break from that in a very different way. It's no longer the reading. So Schneider, for example, will read with Freud against Stalin, right? And looking at with Freud against Marx and the Marx of Stalin, but with Marx against Freudian ego psychology and reductionism. It's a very interesting book, and he does some interesting stuff with the double bind that I want to go to later too in the course on by Bateson, you know, in terms of the relationship of double messaging and cybernetics and the mother, you know, in schizoid genesis in some ways. But I want to go back to what, Carl, did you want to point out anything towards the end that really struck you? Because I think you went to the right pages in terms of, you know, where they're going here in terms of not only the body with organs, but the schizoid itself, how they're going to begin to figure the schizoid, conceptualize. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'd like to hear what other, I mean, one was just what I said, is that it seems like there's, you know, a certain reintroduction of a dichotomy between the social and the unconscious, that, and so I guess that there's, you know, I guess just reading it, it's very interesting what they're doing. I also tend to think that different levels of phenomena have different organizing principles, perhaps. So I would be wary to just try immediately collapse the unconscious into the logic or categories of capital or vice versa.
Okay.
So
let me maybe we can do a commentary on the text itself to kind of clarify what you're saying. So if you turn to page 4, in fact, I'm going to begin at a section that's kind of interesting here. Page 33, I'm sorry, at the top of the page. We can say that social production under determinate conditions derives primarily from desiring production, which is to say that homo natura comes first. But we also must say, more accurately, that desiring production is first and foremost social in nature, and tends to free itself only at the end, which is to say that homo historia comes first. The body without organs is not an original primordial entity that later projects itself into different sorts of socius, as though it were a raving paranoiac. The chieftain of the primitive horde who was initially responsible for social organizations. Those of you know that Freud, this is a play on totem and taboo and the primordial father and the advent of the brotherhood, which was a text written against Carl Jung, basically, to symbolically kill Jung's, defection, if you will. All right, the social machine or the socius may be the body of the earth, right? The body of the despot, the body of money. It is never a projection, however, of the body without organs. On the contrary, the body without organs is the ultimate residuum of a deterritorialized socius. The prime function incumbent upon the socius has always been to codify the flows of desire, to inscribe them, to record them, to see to it that no flow exists that is not probably dammed up, right? Channeled and regulated, right? Very important here. When the primitive territorial machine, and this is a reading, look, again, totem of taboo, and I mean, these are very educated people, and of course, the wild thought, which a terrible translation, The Savage Mind of Levi Strauss. It's really the wild flower, terrible translation of the book. Anyway, the despotic machine, right, when the primitive territorial machine proved inadequate to the task, the despotic machine sets up a kind of overcoding machine. But the capitalist machine, insofar as it was built on the ruins of a despotic state, more or less far removed in time, finds itself in a totally new situation. It is faced with the task of decoding and deterritorializing the flows. Capitalism does not confront the situation from the outside, since it experiences it at the very fabric of its existence, as both as its primary determinant and fundamental raw material, its form and its function, and deliberately perpetuates it in all its violence with all the powers at its command. Its sovereign production and repression can be achieved in no other way. Capitalism is in fact born of the encounter of two sorts of flows. One, the decoded flows of production in the form of money-capital, right? This is the crucial chapter, and by the way, the Althusserian reading of Capital begin with the chapter on money. Forget commodity and commodity fetishism. This is the Althusserian strategy of reading Capital. I want people to be aware. They're very well aware of this, right? And then secondly, the decoded flows of labor in the form of the free worker. You can read slave there. You can read indentured servitude, etc., the free worker. Hence, unlike previous social machines, the capitalist machine is incapable of providing a code that will apply to the whole of the social field. By substituting money for the very notion of a code, it has created, and this is interesting, an axiomatic of abstract quantities that keep moving further and further in the direction of the deterritorialization of the socius. Capitalism turns towards a threshold of decoding that will destroy the socius in order to make it a body without organs and unleash the flows of desire on this body as a deterritorialized field. Is it correct to say that in this sense, schizophrenia is the product of the capitalist machine, as manic depression and paranoia are the product of the despotic machine, and hysteria the product of the territorial machine? These are very radical questions, I think, in a very radical passage. I don't know if you have any commentary. Again, like I said, this is the Marx speaking through them. Yes, Carl, I see you unmuted. Well, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm just curious how other people reacted. I mean, when I read this, and at various points, like one of the questions is that they're describing this function to the socius of coding and inscribing and regulating.
Yes.
And in some sense, that seems to get back to the question you were raising earlier about why do we desire fascism? And like part of me, I thought, well, who is doing this inscribing? It just seems to appear in this book, but it's not really clear how it's being done.
Maybe we should ask the what instead of the who.
What, yeah, or what?
The what of the inscribing rather than the who, right? I mean, I just want to be careful here. That's all. Yeah.
Right. What is, yes.
What is the inscribing machine?
And then the other thing that I just kind of got out of this is that it seems that you could say that they're almost attributing to capitalism a certain liberatory moment, or capitalism is this decoding, freeing, decentering force, and that again it's sort of being colonized or reordered by the state and the family and psychoanalysis and all the things they don't like. So those were just
okay. I mean, on the surface I can see where you get that, but if we continue in the paragraph and we go to the next page, and maybe does anyone else want to comment on this? I mean, have some thoughts? Yeah, Bruno, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, the inscribing, which is a very important moment, it's like the recording, right? I mean, where you look at the moment of producing and then recording or inscribing, and that goes back precisely to the beginning of this chapter, right? The conjunctive and the disjunctive synthesis, but it is the disjunctive synthesis in particular which precisely names the open field of contingency, right? Either or. I mean, that's the movement whereby contingency constantly produces and inscribes something new. So I think that it is that overlapping of the two syntheses that may, also help in the reading of what comes now toward the end of the chapter.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
To reply? I see you have your hand up again. Yeah. Carl, did you want to say something, or okay? I'm just reading the chat. I saw that Carl raised his hand. Anybody else? Some thoughts about this passage? This again is crucial to me. This last section, from where I read from Reich, posing the critique of Reich, if in a way going beyond Reich in terms of posing this question of why is it that we're put in this position of humiliation and being desirous of servitude rather than our liberation as the primary ethical question, into the founding of a materialist psychiatry that is based on the figure of the schizoid. How is the schizoid produced, and why is this book called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, right? What is that relation? It's not called psychoanalysis or neurology and schizophrenia. It's called capitalism and schizophrenia. What is this symptom that is again being produced, and why is the schizoid so prevalent here? Because as you know, looking at the table of contents, I'm sure you haven't, maybe some of you have read the entire book, but anyway, they're going to go into where we'll end the task of schizoid analysis, taking a different type of approach than the psychoanalytic, right? In a way. And what Bruno's speaking about is where they begin in terms of their reading of the literature. Lentz on a Stroll, Buchner's Lentz, right, on a Stroll, is more applicable, as is the Lady Petal taking the schizoid out for a stroll in Beckett's trilogy, in the Malone trilogy there too. So they recognize this very much. They're again looking at this moment of the disjunctive, right? And the dematerialization. Yes, Hugo. Yeah, I see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I'm thinking that maybe
and then Richard,
the sort of description or outlining of this mechanism is maybe what sort of makes us desire servitude and fascism, that the enslavement of ourselves to this mechanism is what produces that voluntary servitude. It's this kind of dual, sort of both the enticement of liberation that decoded and deterritorialized capitalism seems to offer, but then it gets reinscribed into a set of regimes and sort of disciplinary protocols. Sounds a bit like Foucault, but the sort of notion that we're being pushed and pulled on some level, that desire is manipulated, is not free, and isn't in any kind of authentic relation to self or nature. And it is a trap ultimately. It's this architecture of servitude that gets constructed through the capture of desire, something like that.
Well, I like your Kantian approach. I'm hearing a lot of stuff here that's very, very Kantian and very well ordered. And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting logic to understand. The second, if you will, wave of capitalism into the manufacturing, almost into the industrial phase. So yeah, very, very well put, and we can go back to that in many ways. Okay, Richard, yes, since you. Yeah.
So when I did, just an anecdote, when I did my doctoral dissertation on the rise of mental health care in the United States, particularly around schizophrenia, I'm named after, or I'm not named after, someone who is schizophrenic, and who spent all his life in a hospital, escaped and then was hit by a train. I say I was not named after schizophrenic because he was named after his father, named Richard. So ironically, I'm not named, I was always told I wasn't, but I did a piece of performance art based on his records. And what struck me was that the records that were intended to tell a story about him also told a story about the storytellers and about that period of time.
Right.
And I went to work at a outpatient center for severely mentally ill, most of them psychotic, diagnosed with psychosis. It was an outpatient center, which is very rare. I mean, you're either imprisoned usually in a psychiatric hospital or you're left on the street with a handful of drugs. This was a unusual program where people were in supportive housing, and then they would come and spend their day at this outpatient center for severely chronically mentally ill. And I ran groups where I couldn't run clinical groups because I'm not a clinician, but I ran groups where we read aloud the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville. And and they were called clients, and they really loved it because they didn't have to reproduce their symptoms in a way or reproduce themselves as objects of psychiatry. So I would sit in a few times on these clinical groups, and you could, they really had to. I also taught weekend, which is, what to do on a weekend. And they really liked these because they got to, express themselves through the sound of their voice, reading Poe or Hawthorne or Melville. And then I also assistant directed the theater program. And in the theater program, the clients or patients came up with a play that they made up called Room 13A. And it was about a drug that cured all mental illness, but had one side effect. And the one side effect was that it brought back the dead. And that program, which was an amazing program, was replaced. They said it wasn't useful. They replaced it with a quote unquote theater program where they thought was much more realistic, where the patients would play people taking your bag at a store and giving you a number so that you could reclaim your bag on leaving. So the idea is, or working in a fast food joint. So, again, the poetry and literature, that's what I really pick up on, is that is liberating, and they do it in a amazingly inspiring way. Obviously, if there's so many people, philosophers, critics, anthropologists today that are so inspired by Deleuze and Guattari, regardless of how correct or not correct they get Freud. That's just so powerful, and to me rings true versus the way in which these institutions tend to try to reproduce from the schizophrenic the neurotic or the normal consumer.
Right. That's a very good point. Again, to go back to where we started again last week, the idea here is the unconscious cannot be theatrically represented. The unconscious is a factory. They begin very materialistically within a Marxist framework. This begins with Marx. It is a factory, it shits, it eats, it, et cetera, et cetera. It, it fucks, it does everything, possible. The it is it's the factory that is really at stake here. It's a machine-like thing. The motors are always going, et cetera. This is a reading, at least in the beginning here, a very imaginative reading of pages 690 through 720 of volume of the Grundrisse, on the machine. This is a very creative reading of this. I mean, Bruno can probably attest to this since he's written on this in terms of his book on labor and fire in his early work. So anyway, this is the beginning, if you will, of their attack upon the neurotic on the couch, the family romance being theatricalized, right, etc., the drama of the period. So again, this is not your standard, Ibsen, your Chekhov, your theater, your Aristotelian theater anymore. There's no notion of the cathartic as we get an abreaction that goes back to Aristotle. There's a very different stake at work here. Whether you agree or not is not the point. We're trying to understand, right? This is the working premise. That what a mistake to call it id. What a mistake to call it, this kind of triangulation in terms of its topography. It is a factory, right? That's what we're doing. This is what industrial-financial capital has done. It has created this factory. It is not an image either that is being, not image production either. They go against image. The body without organs, no image. Again, right? I mean, again, from the outside in, I used the figure of the egg last time. It's the egg, the cosmic egg from which we're born. I don't know if you know the, what's the name of the painting, the new man being born, kind of out of the egg. I forgot the art. Dali's, the new man being born, out of the egg. This is a great thing. And of course, Linder's piece, and Linder, is very affected by German expressionism too. You can see a lot of this, but The Boy with the Machine, this book in some ways, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that they take this painting done in 1954 as part of their background, right? Even though this is a work of 15, 20 years later. It wasn't, quote, in the present chronological moment, right? It's something that reflected what they're trying to do in terms of this connectivity. So again, I think what we have to do here is understand, first and foremost, that they're beginning with the social field, right? And they're using a language, instead of saying the productive process or immediate processes of production in the Marxist, in capital, if you will, they're using desiring production as an attempt to go beyond the standard approaches to the Marx-Freud, synthesis. They're trying to go well beyond. I find this book much more sophisticated, with all due respect to Herbert Marcuse, who I love, than Eros and Civilization, and another book, The Meditation, Life Against Death by Norman O. Brown, which to me are two classic meta attempts to take on both Freud and Marx together and bring it together. One is basically a psychoanalytic theory of history. So again, if we attune ourselves to this language, I'm not saying we have to go around crying, oh, it's the socius, every day, but at least to see what their working premises are, where they're going here. And this is not a logical book, the way we're accustomed to. There are many, many contradictions that go on through here, but part of the problem, some of you are, I hope, looking at Masumi, who I think is very good with this, and his book on a user's guide. He'll talk about the notion of relay. So we're in this process of relay. We're passing batons of ideas and forces in the text, going back and forth. So in this way, it gives it a very different force, in my opinion, as we proceed. So I think we should read it this way, in a sense, not to judge it immediately in terms of what we know, to kind of suspend that, if you will, to kind of phenomenologically suspend it and follow its lines, if you will, rather than its logic or what we impose, or it's so crazy here or there. It's its lines. He makes a very good comment about Malcolm Lowry. I don't know if you've read Under the Volcano, but Malcolm Lowry was very alcoholic. He drank like crazy. He had a very rough life, but Under the Volcano is a great book. He lived in Mexico, and the great story about Malcolm Lowry, he was sitting in a bar ordering another drink, and he put his hands over his head and he yelled out, "Oh, Sophocles, oh, Oedipus," right? The complex itself in a certain way. But they're looking at this as a machinic production, as a social field production, right? Against that dominant way of re-Oedipalizing, re-territorializing literature. So these are all outsiders. They're not reading the dominant literature. And another way of reading this book is it's against Romanticism. It's against the tradition of Goethe, out of which Freud comes. out of that 19th century model. This is primarily outside of these models. It's Kleist against Goethe. It's, you know, there are many levels. Yes, David, I see your hand up. I'm sorry. Yeah. You need to unmute though. Yeah. You need to unmute. You need to give us a voice. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to say thanks for the class. It's so interesting. But if we look at, if these people could see where we are now in American politics with the phenomenon of QAnon, you know, an interesting kind of really quite psychotic cult,
Right.
how would they see the inscribing of this particular phase of capitalism?
Right.
Is it its post-proletariat collapse, so there's not really the proletariat as the way Marx understood it? Is it a way that the delusion is kind of feeding the perverse negation of the desiring machine, so it can only create destructively? Kind of like Bion would go with kind of a concept like negative K? Just curious your take
No,
on
it's very interesting. I mean, you know, listen, I've been doing a little research on all these new SPACs, they call them, special project acquisition companies. You know, this is the new rave on Wall Street. And I've been following this, you know, person, Kathy Wood, who's gotten, you know, has been, you know, picking stocks like they're going out, you know, she's winning the lottery. She's getting hit a little bit now, but anyway, but this comes to me out of, you know, her master was Arthur Laffer, the Laffer curve, for us old enough to remember this going on in Reaganomics, right? In a sense. So I think what was set up was a complete perversion, you know, in the counter-revolutionary moments during the 70s. What has been set up, we're just seeing these new symptoms of, you know, deterritorialization, but things that are reterrorized on the most primitive level, not on an advanced level. One of the reasons they want to go to this literature of Antonin Artaud and to, you know, Heinrich von Kleist's Penthesilea, which is, if you haven't read Penthesilea, it's great. It's about the feminists kidnapping, you know, the Amazon women kidnapping Achilles and creating a feminist army. You know, it makes this Wonder Woman nonsense look like, you know, child's play when you really think about what he's setting up 200 years ago. So anyway, all to say, I mean, it's very hard to see how this was pulled, how is this being pulled off? You know, that's one of my interests. You know, how, you know, in terms of this ethical question, how does this constantly go on? I mean, we're going to be in sleepy time America for the next 2 years up until the midterms. I already know this. They're already pulling off. Think about this. Everybody's relieved. We talked about this last week. Relieved. We're kind of abreacted from Donald Trump, right? In some ways, we have this relief, right? We stand back. Woo! We celebrate on the streets. Party time, right? In a certain way. What are we getting? Right? In a sense, right?
Period.
Yeah, really. What are we getting? We're getting nothing in terms of progress, right? We're getting what E.P. Thompson called the paternalistic model of history. Throw a little money at the masses, you know, $400 more to the unemployment benefit until August. Give them a $1,400 check. Nothing systemically is being engaged. He can't even get minimum wage through the Congress. Right, already, right? So think about this, where we are in terms of regression, if you want to use that kind of language, where we are. So the question is, to me, is how has this been not only re-inscribed and re-territorialized, but why is it that people, you know, why isn't there, you know, as Reich says, why don't people steal? Why aren't more banks being robbed? You know, like Brecht would say, why aren't there more hackers instead of this nonsense with Re-Edit, where they take some bankrupt company like that GameStop? You know, think about these actions that are going on in finance capital. Instead, why isn't there hacking, you know, at a level to take on, you know, different levels of finance capital? You know, why is this not going on? You know, in a sense. So these are the questions, I guess, again, and I'm not so sure they give us an explanatory model, but they certainly give us a language of flows and you know, movement that is much more powerful than the standard thing that, you know, the killers of George Floyd were, you know, Ku Klux Klan members. Like, we need to know that. I mean, you know what I mean. I'm just saying, in the standard stock of, or they had a disturbed childhood and therefore, had to pick up a gun because, etc. Right? The usual stuff, the Rolodex for the dominant media and even the alternative media at this point. So this to me is quite, Carl again, sorry. And Dad, you want to say something else?
Sure that we touched a little bit on the body without organs before.
Sure.
Disjunctive synthesis, because I just thought that was a very
okay. So you want to go back? I mean, the body with organs is first mentioned, as you know, early in the section, right? And they actually define it too, right? I mean, do you have a particular moment that you want to speak to in terms of the body without organs?
No.
Okay.
I guess I just is curious as how you understand that. I had some questions about understanding the socius and capital as a body without organs. I don't know that I fully understand what they mean by that, and I don't know if that corresponds to at least my understanding of Marx. I think that but it seemed a little fuzzy to me in terms of, and there are a lot of things they began to introduce, like the desire and machine attach themselves to the body with organs, and again it seemed like poetic, but I don't think Marx was. He was actually trying to understand real processes and systems, logics that he was trying to unpack and show how they are, in one sense, self-reproducing at the same time that they have internal contradictions that lead to transformations, breakdowns, reconfigure those types of things.
Again, I want to emphasize that for Deleuze and Guattari, we are producers, right? The desiring machine is a producing machine. There's not this kind of Hegelian, moment that we get from Marx of production, consumption, and distribution and exchange value that's articulated in the Grundrisse. They're not, they'll go there later, they'll talk about it, but in the beginning, the working premise is we are producing, we are being as producers, right? In this way, and the connection is also to the will to power. So power and production are always already operative in this sense. I think what they're doing here, again, is the trying to look at the body without organs as, again, a space that ultimately becomes the non-productive stasis, right? In a sense. And that this is what we get in terms of, they'll talk about, the Victor Tosk, so maybe some of you know, was a part of the psychoanalytic movement who did very good work on wartime neuroses. Lou Andreas Salome liked him. Freud didn't like that they're so close, and he, kind of had problems with Victor Tosk. And, again, Felix knows this history very well in terms of psychoanalytic stories. But anyway, he says, this is the difference here. And I want to relate this, and I mean, maybe I'm evading what you're saying, but I want to show that there are connections here to body without organs versus that of paranoid machines and then the schizoid, right? Because again, they're trying to conceptualize, or which you said, an assemblage, if you will, of this concept of the schizoid, right? As the symptom, right? The last symptom of capital, where we are. And also at the same time that the paranoid is still within, the body itself. So the schizoid is experiencing the body without organs, right? In a way. Whereas the paranoid is basically a machine of the projection of a person's own body and the genitalia, the genital organs. This is Tosk speaking. They do not agree. He says that the genesis of the machine writes in the opposition of the process of the production of desiring machines and the non-productive stasis, right, of the body without organs. This is where production is located, between the body without organs and the production of desiring machines. So the anonymous nature of the machine and the non-differentiated nature of its service are proof. So projection enters the picture only secondarily. So this to him, you know, you think about extraction of raw materials right here from nature, you know, in a sense, you know, how does capital work? You know, the modern trinity, of course, land, labor, and capital that Marx speaks about in the Trinitarian. But they're speaking here again of that the production process and the production itself only enters the picture as counter-invested as the body without organs invests a counter inside or a counter outside in the form of a persecuting organ or some exterior agent of persecution. But in and of itself, the paranoid machine is an avatar of the desiring machine. So remember, look, this is very complicated in the sense that they're using psychoanalytic theory, you know, the paranoid and how a paranoid is diagnosed and what happens in this socius, right? But at the same time, how the paranoid machine is only an avatar of the desiring machine, is a result of the relationship of the desiring machines in the body without, and occurs when the latter can no longer tolerate those machines, the desiring machines.
Michael?
So really, in a sense, the paranoia. Yeah, Lloyd. Yeah, please.
It's David Winters.
Oh, David. Yeah.
I just wanted to read. I don't want to exactly interrupt.
That's okay. I mean, I'm trying to, you know, see how they operate here. But go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to read a line from the bottom of page 11, where I think they do their sort of most Marxist description of what they mean by a body without organs. And I thought
falling back on desire, protection, and surplus value, and
yes, well, on the fetish of it. And I thought you might be able to connect what you're saying to.
Yeah, why don't you read that then? That some kind of full body, that the earth of the despot. Is that where you're going?
Just the I mean, literally the last. I'll just read a tiny bit. The last line of page 11 that goes into page 12 goes. But the essential thing is the establishment of an enchanted recording or inscribing surface that arrogates to itself all the productive forces, right? And all the organs of production, and that acts as a quasi-cause. So acts as the cause by communicating the apparent movement, the fetish, to them. So this is where like I pick up like they're hewing like pretty closely to Marx's concept of the fetish, but like not exactly. There's a reason they're not just saying like fetishism the way that Marx uses it, but they're hewing very closely to what Marx is doing with fetishism there.
Okay.
Right, that like it's the thing that appears to do what is now hidden within it or behind it. Is the essential thing about the body without organs, is I think what's being said there. I don't know. That's how I'm.
Okay, yeah. Carl, you want to?
I picked up on that passage also, and I agree with that. Where I find it interesting though is that then they'll talk about the body without organs as a surface and something upon which it's almost like writing takes place or inscription. Yeah. The way I read it is that the inscription in capital occurs through money, and that's almost the medium of writing in some sense on this body without organs. But again, it's surface is kind of a different idea than fetish. To me, they're not quite the same. So
if I may, Michael.
Yeah, please.
You know, the body without organs, especially if you go to page 12 and 13, makes me think of the concept of the neutral, the neither nor, right? Because we have the end and then of the conjunctive synthesis, the either or the disjunctive. But then we know the importance of Duns Scotus for Deleuze, right? So this idea of the univocity, the neither nor, the neutral, seems to be present precisely on page 12, 13, the body without organs, and also, you know, another important figure not mentioned here for them, Simondon. There is this transductive, the moment of transduction. They speak of the body without organs as energy, right? I mean, the energy.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
I mean, page 13, the body without organs is not God, quite the contrary, but the energy that sweeps through it is divine. You know, so there is this constant, and then the schizoid is, to use another expression by Deleuze and Guattari, a line of flight. That's the only probably line of flight, right? That that is left in this production of schizophrenia itself, which is, they say, capitalism produces it. And they do speak of the production of production. So there is this production, there is distribution, which is the inscription or the recording, and there must be an exit.
And always an exit, right?
Right, but the body without organs is, I don't know, it's not probably correct to say that. I mean, it's not a kind of ground. There is no ground. It's all a flow, but it is this kind of constant energy, no?
Yes.
Which is neither this nor that.
That's correct.
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, that's well put. Yes, Josepha. Yeah, please. Yeah. Or Eloy, and then Josepha, and then Eloy. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think we're all getting there, but this is a hard concept, I think.
Yes.
And, the thing that kind of helps me a little bit to understand it is to think of the body without organs as something that is not really organized. That's not really, that doesn't have an identity, let's say. A little bit like the virtual that Deleuze talks about in other books. So it's something, it's an energy, like Bruno said, and it's a slate. I think Carl said that. So it's like a space where things meet, or where things, for instance, if you're talking about virtuality, so if the virtual is, let's say, the idea of marriage, it's a virtuality, right? And then so it's like a slate where then two bodies meet and then it becomes actual, let's say. So I see it that way as something without any organization, but it has the energy and the virtuality of becoming something. So it's a space where, some other person has said it's like a field that as soon as you see a ball and it's a soccer ball and you see a player, then becomes a soccer field. So it's redefined. So it's a virtuality, it's a space where things become something. And so until they become something, they're body without organs, let's say, something that's not defined. So I don't know if this helps, but that's how it's
it's very, very helpful. And Eloy, I know you've had your hand up for a while. I'm going to go to you before.
Yes, I think that's a concept that I would like to clarify a little bit. Is that we get into it, because I understood it as an alienated body somehow. But a body is never fully completely alienated. It always has some energy, right? The driving force for survival. And so in page number 11 says, the body without organs, the unproductive, the unconsumable, serves as a surface for the recording of the entire process of production of desire, so that desiring machines seem to emanate from it in the apparent objective movement that establishes a relationship between the machinist and the body without organs.
And to follow on the psychoanalytic, where they go there in the context is to the case of Daniel Paul Schreber, who was the paranoid example, right, in Freudian psychoanalysis that they're using.
So if I have a question.
Please. Who thought he was miraculated by God. Anyway. Okay, please.
How is that the bodies without organs are in opposition to desiring machines, which is actually kind of the starting point of the chapter? So it's not clear to me very much. I understood it probably, badly understood this contradiction between apparent conflict arises between desiring machines and the body without organs, as the repression, the repression or the subjection towards our bodies, the subjection of the body by the totalizing system we live in, and so. But it's not clear to me. I really would like to get out of here with a more or less clear idea about what the body without organ is, and how is that linked to the desiring machines, or unlinked to it. Yeah, just doubts.
I don't know if we're going to get a clear idea. We'll try to understand the process, but yeah.
The machines have orifices that attach, and
Right.
therefore territories.
Right.
So the attachment between humans and part humans and their erotogenic zones is the functioning of the machine, the desiring machine, and that leads to all the rest of it, all the totalizing, etc. And so the body without organs is like a field that flows within that machinic relation, but can also be freed from attachment.
Right. That's very well put. I mean, you know, and especially the notion of attachment and detachment, which is constantly going on, that he gets, I mean, you know, again, they're reading, you know, schizophrenic artists here too, such as Antonin Artaud, right, is also part of this background here. So one way of reading the text, again, I mean, these are just, you know, small little hints, and I'm not saying I haven't figured out by any means, I don't, you know, I would just explicate fully body without organs, but they're always using the background of in this section, it's really Beckett and Antonin Artaud's, you know, relations to you know, their own poetics and their creations, where they're drawing the theoretical movement, you know, going forward. How is it these characters come in, you know, such as the body is the body, it is all by up or strangling it by organizing it, has no need of organs. The body is never an organism. Organisms are the enemies of the body. This is Antonin Artaud early on, and you know, so they're looking at this, the lady pedal with the Beckett, the schizophrenics on a stroll. They just want to keep strolling. They still want to keep rowing the boat, so to speak. You know, all of these things are being presupposed in terms of, you know, moments. Yeah, Bruno, yeah.
No, to the question raised by Eloy, but did you, Eloy, say opposition, that you see this opposition between the body without organ and the machine? No, I don't know if I.
Yeah.
Because it is rather a movement of a process of emanation. They use the word emanation, which is also a Spinozian, right? Or, you know, generally, you know, this. So this, therefore, this there is this continuum rather than I don't know if this may help, but that's the way I see the relation, no? In the production of production, precisely between this body without organ, which is not a body as right in the usual sense of the word, precisely it is this flow, this energy, and so on, and the desiring machine that again is not a machine, it's not a thing, but it is this amplification of power, right? I don't know if that helps.
Well, I think Bruno does a good thing. It's not oppositional, Eloy. It's not either or it's not, you know, in that kind of relationship. You know, it's much more a part of these different kinds of syntheses that they're trying to produce here, right? You know, in a sense, it's a very different logic than what we're accustomed to. You know, again, it's not the usual kind of, you said this, I'm antithetical to that, you know, in a sense. It's, as Bruno says,
but in the
page Spinoza's and its emanations. Yeah, go ahead, Eloy. Yeah.
But in the page number 8, it says, okay, it says that this is the real meaning of the paranoid machine. The desiring machines attempt to break into the body without organs, and the body without organs repels them, since it experiences them as an overall persecution apparatus. Thus, we cannot agree with Victor Taus that when he regards the paranoid machine as the mere projection of the personal body, No, sorry. We are of the opinion that what is ordinarily referred to as primary repression means precisely that. It is not a counter-catexis, but rather this repulsion of desiring machines by the body without organs. There is a repulsion. Body organs repulse body. Desiring machine is what I understood. And so they are not, they are in counter currents. They are not friends.
And I also picked that up, is that they have sort of different logics. The desiring machines are connective. Right. The body without organs functions through disjunction. And then there's actually this attempt to sort of reconcile these two things, which is
or conjunctive. Bring them together as an and, instead of not really reconciled in the Hegelian sense, but to build it as a conjunctive synthesis.
And the
again, these three syntheses that I'll put in the web page, for next time, because we're working with this at many levels today.
Yeah.
This notion of the connective, the disjunctive, and then of course the conjunctive. Yeah.
But I did also think that there's a tension that they don't operate exactly within the same register or according to the same logic. So.
Right. But I mean, I think going back to this whole thing with the body without organs and the whole notion of the energy is very important to remember too. It's not like just our body, it's energy out there, right? I mean, it's again, this is very much very much in terms of modern physics. They're also looking at this and molecular biology. They're not just amateurs here saying we're throwing around some language. They're careful with what they do. This is very important to keep in mind. This is about energy and matter in a different way.
When it's over.
The socius. I'm sorry. Hello? What? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, yeah. I mean, again, look. Section 2 is trying to define the body without organs in terms of they to make steps. I mean, they do steps, right? So if we read this carefully, instead of impose, we begin to maybe see some of the connections that they're making in their own machinic logic, if you will, right? In a sense. So they on page 10, for example, if we wish to have some idea of the forces that the body without organs exerts later on in the uninterrupted process, we must first establish, and this is good, establish a parallel between desiring production and social production, right? Between desiring production and social. We intend such a parallel to be regarded as merely phenomenological. We are here drawing no conclusions whatsoever to the nature and the relationship of the two productions, nor does the parallel we're about to establish provide any sort of a priori answer to the question whether desiring production and social production are really two separate and distinct productions. But its purpose is to point out the fact that the forms of social production, like those of desiring production, involve an unengendered, non-productive attitude, an element of anti-production coupled with a process, a full body that functions as a socius. So this is their new term that they introduce. Instead of the social field, they introduce a new term, socius. This is a neologism that they're going to operate with, right? This coupled with the process, a full body that functions as a socius. This socius may be the body of the earth, that of the tyrant, or of capital. So this is the new term that is really engaged here, with desiring production and social production. This is the body that Marx is referring to when he says that it is not the product of labor, but rather appears as its natural or divine presupposition. In fact, it does not restrict itself merely to opposing productive forces in and of themselves. It falls back on the, he uses the il se rebat sur, it falls back on, so to speak, all production, maybe reverberates on itself, all production constituting a surface. And this is where Carl's, got it. A surface over which the forces and agents of production constituting the surface over which the forces and agents of production are distributed, thereby appropriating for itself all surplus production and arrogating to itself both the whole and the parts of the process, which now seem to emanate from it as a quasi-cause. Forces and agents come to represent a miraculous form of its own power. They appear to be miraculated by it. In a word, the socius as a full body, again, the concept of the socius, this is the assemblage that's working, to use that language, forms a surface where all production is recorded. And this is important, where production is recorded, right? Whereupon the entire process appears to emanate from this recording surface. Society constructs its own delirium by recording the processes of production, but it is not a conscious delirium, or rather, is it a true consciousness of a false movement, a true perception of an apparent objective movement, a true perception of the movement that is produced on the recording surface. Capital itself, and remember, they're trying to figure out what is capital, right? We talk about it, we do it. They're looking at this in terms of this notion, this neologism, the socius. Capital is indeed the body without organs of the capitalist, or rather of the capitalist being, right? But as such, it is not only the fluid and petrified substance of money, for it will give to the sterility of money the form, for it give the sterility of money the form whereby money produces money, right? And again, this is a reading of the section on money and the transformation problem of money into capital. It produces surplus value, just as the body without organs reproduces itself, puts forth shoots, branches out to the farthest corners of the universe. It makes the machine responsible for producing a relative surplus value while embodying itself in the machine as fixed capital. Machines and agents cling so closely to capital that their very functioning appears to be miraculated by it. Everything is objectively seems to be produced by capital as quasi-cause. As Marx observes, in the beginning, capitalists are necessarily conscious of the opposition between capital and labor and the use of capital as a means for extorting surplus labor. But a perverted, bewitched world quickly comes into being as capital increasingly plays the role of a recording surface that falls back again on all the production. Furnishing or realizing surplus value is what establishes recording rights. This is what capital does. This is its patent on our everyday life, what it happens to surplus value. You can think about this in terms of what is Spotify to musicians, what is stealing of ideas from writers, et cetera, et cetera. With the development of relative surplus value as the actually specifically capitalist mode of production, whereby the productive powers of social labor are developed, these productive powers and the social interrelations of labor in the direct labor process seem transferred from labor to capital. Capital then becomes a mystic being, a very mystic, since all of labor's social productive forces appear to be due to capital rather than labor as such, and seem to issue from the womb of capital itself. What is specifically capitalist here is the role of money and the use of capital as a full body to constitute the recording or the inscribing surface. But some kind of full body, that of the earth or the despot, a recording surface, an apparent objective movement, a fetishistic, perverted, bewitched world are characterized of all types of society as a constant of social reproduction. Okay, so I think this gives us a sense, right, of where this body without organs and desiring, really you have to think of this again, the concept that's behind this is the socius. This is what they're really introducing. is the socius, right? Instead of social relations, determining our consciousness, as Marx presupposes, says in the German ideology, we're now thrown into a new concept called the socius, which is about desiring production and its relationship to the body without organs, right? And how this works. And they're going back to looking at what is this founding moment of the capitalist machine, etc. What is capital as a body without organs, as of the capitalist, or really that of the capitalist being? So in a way, they're doing a kind of ontology, if you will, or an investigation of what is capital. What is capital? Not just reading capital, not just thinking capital through and what it does to us, etc., but asking the question of what is it in terms of what it has done in its inscriptions, and this relationship, once again, between desiring production and the production of production, as Bruno points out. It's a producing, right, as producer, and at the same time, this relationship to this body without organs, to this energy force, if you will. So I don't know if this helps, but this is kind of the background in terms of where the concept itself begins to think, right? Okay. So yeah, Justin, you want to go with your work, the premise there? Yeah.
It's the question. That the body without organs must be for any kind of desiring production, any kind of assemblage, like that has to be part of the dynamic. That's a question.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Especially in capitalism, because it introduces, in a sense, the capitalism introduces the body without organs. And the schizoid, in a way, to go a little further, right? We have to have this moment, if you will, of the line of flight. And it's the schizoid line of flights that is the beginning of the way out, if you will, the exit, to go way ahead of where we are right now. But what we're really trying to understand is this concept of the socius and how to work it out, right? Okay. So yeah, Tony, you were saying, and vice versa, the relationship both of the capital. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah. No, just in order to not put one above the other, but
yeah, that's right. It's not hierarchical. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's just all I wanted to point out.
Yeah, if we can think in terms of movements, and if we think in terms of flow and force, and I think that this is very important. If we can think in those kind of terms, we're going to get much more out of this, right? Than, our already we all have it. I'm not, our own prejudice that we bring to the table there, to really see this at work, how this text is not only constructed, right, and what's really going on with the art, the interspersing, but then how they're building a whole new kind of conceptual nexus to try to understand this relationship of what, the splitting of the subject. Look, back to where Lydia began today, in some ways, what Deleuze and Guattari are very upset about, in a sense, with psychoanalysis, is that psychoanalysis somewhat is built on the splitting of the subject, on the Spaltung of the subject, right? It is an attempt to repair, right, that splitting. In some ways, this is part of what goes on in the sessions, and they find that to be, the policing aspect of psychoanalysis. They don't deterritorialize enough, right? They're not into, taking this, to the next dimension, if you will, or to the next order of revolution, right? Remember, this is also about all power to the imagination. The slogan of May of '68. They're certainly in that moment very much, and there are a lot of other cross currents going on here. But again, to understand this body without organs, maybe I should again put some stuff out there about that. I mean, I want us to read it though internally, right, rather than just have just an because I think it's a fun book that way. if you follow it along, because what they're prefacing all this with, again, before this starts, the desiring machines and Judge Schraber only function when they break down. And what Lydia very well put out about Judge Schraber, they're connecting orifices here, and there is the body still with the orifice. Judge Schraber's thing is he thought he was miraculated by God, by the divine. This was the concept of the solar anus. Yeah, Richard, please. Yeah.
I found out the other day that Freud smoked 20 cigars a day.
Yes.
Talk about being a desiring machine. I mean,
yes.
Or talk about, the orifice and anyway.
And the orality.
Yeah.
Yeah, the orality. I have another theory. This is very surface, but about the oral regression of the last 40 years. Everybody's a foodie now. We just, we're eating, we're not really thinking. We have gone back to this kind of very oral, primitive, fixation. And so this has been the birth of the, I mean, every other article in the New York Times during COVID is when the restaurants are going to come back, or our great workers in the restaurant. And now, what's the name of the guy, the bandit that's leaving the big tips? I don't know if you've heard about this guy, but he's leaving $1,000 tips to waitresses in I think Arizona or Colorado. I forgot exactly where it was. Not New York City. That would be unheard of. And of course,
the other side, the contemporary, is in relation to their work is the computers, machines.
Yes,
they seem to be so prophetic in terms of
I think so.
What's happening now. Their imagery, their way of thinking about image without body, body without organs and such, seems very very of this time, and incredibly inspiring to go back and get in touch with this incredible source of energy, this Delphic source of energy that is their work.
Right. No, good point. I just want to mention another thing vis-a-vis what Carl said. If you look at page earlier on page 8, the section on Schraber, lived for a long time without a stomach, without intestines, almost without lungs, with a torn esophagus, without a bladder, and shattered ribs. He used sometimes to swallow part of his own larynx with his food, right? This is the speaking of the clinical study, right? The body without organs is non-productive. Nonetheless, it is produced at a certain place and a certain time in the connective synthesis, right? As the identity of producing and the product together. As Bruno mentioned earlier, there's no real difference between the producing and the product. The schizophrenic table is a body without organs. I think this is crucial. The body without organs is not the proof of an original nothingness. It's not the Sartrean movement of, being in nothingness and our encounter with the void, if you will, nor is it what remains of a lost totality. Above all, it is not a projection. It has nothing whatever to do, and maybe that's part of our problem. We're trying to project the body without organs, right, in a sense, and they're telling us here it is not a projection, right? It has nothing whatsoever to do with the body itself, right? So the term itself is a kind of contradiction in terms, right? The body without organs is a kind of contradiction itself, part maybe the problem, right? Or
Michael,
with the image of the body. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to insert that there's that they are deliberately differentiating other theories of what I call the pre-Oedipal. In other words, this is not a narcissistic merger of oneness. This is not the internalization of an ego image in a Kleinian or Winnicottian projection or reception, introjection of the image of the self and the other. They're doing psychoanalytic differentiation with that specific sentence.
Yes, I agree with you very much. I mean, and remember, I want to say again that both, and I'll speak about Deleuze's relationship primarily to psychoanalysis. He knew psychoanalysis. I think he was either practiced or knew it well enough to practice it. And as we know, this was an experimental psychoanalyst in Felix, and known as Saint Felix to some, out there in the 70s, especially. So obviously there's a lot of language here, the pre-Oedipal, the Kleinian notions, etc. They actually go through Klein and Bettelheim later in the text. I don't know if you got that far, but the child analysis, when Melanie Klein put the train in front of the kid in the tunnel, right? In a sense, in terms of that object relation. So well put in many ways. The imageless, the body is the body without an image, right? So this is interesting to remember too. Without an image, this imageless, organless body, this non-productive, exists right there where it is produced in the third stage of the binary linear series. It is perpetually reinserted into the process of production. The catatonic body is produced in the water of the hydrotherapy tub. The full body without organs belongs to the realm of the anti-productive, yet another characteristics of the connective or productive synthesis is that it couples production with anti-production. I think what Tony was mentioning too, that the connective synthesis is always looking at the vice versa too, and in this way, with an element of anti-production, right? So this leads us into the section that we were, kind of concentrated on today, the body without organs, and of course the materialist, towards the materialistic psychiatry. I think this is very important, that it's not the imagelessness, right? I don't know, Eloy, if this is helping you, but he is really looking at something that is very, very different, right? They're conversing about something very different than our projections of what the hell is this body without organs, right? In a sense, it's not out of the standard logic that we would exist in terms of oppositions, etc. Right? So yeah, I think this section gives you a very good introduction to what the body without organs is, alongside of and to think of this in terms of and I'll put this in the website and we'll discuss next week, the connective, the disjunctive, and of course the conjunctive syntheses, because this is how they're operating. Remember, as I talked in the beginning tonight, they sat around at the house, right, in Guattari's cluttered room, and I think out on the grounds of the clinic. I can imagine what they were talking about, but they're free associating. They're acting like they're just these streams of knowledge that are coming together. They have working premises, obviously. How do we bring Marx and Freud together in a way? You bring Nietzsche and Spinoza to the table. I bring all this clinical practice. They obviously know this about each other, but in a way, they're not in the process here of saying, oh, we're going to review this and edit this tonight. This ultimately was the taking together of all these notes and then put into a book form with rubrics, right, going forward. So I want you to realize this is not the standard collaborative book project, right, in a way. This is the meeting of, two exceptional minds, one of a militant psychoanalyst who had a lot of Marx background. And in my opinion, he was absolutely right vis-a-vis a militant analyst in terms of an anti-capitalist psychoanalyst, in the sense that he understood psychoanalysis to be ultimately involved in the rotation of family capital. He understood this very well. I mean, I think this is very important to keep in mind. I'm not telling people they should give analysis for free. That's not the issue. He understood that relationship of exchange in the analytic procedure in a very rich way. I'll try to find the essay in which he wrote about this. Go on. Felix wrote about. So anyway, and also at the same time, we have this amazing, philosopher who's coming out of both Spinoza and Nietzsche. And I mean, for the philosophically trained in the room or whatever, or philosophically people that read philosophy actively, such as Bruno and I do, and try to practice it some way, you can see Spinoza and Nietzsche all over this, right? In so many ways. I mean, and really in a way, the encounter to me is more about Marx and Nietzsche than it is about Marx and Freud. I'll just throw that out as a working, thing in the way, a new kind of connective synthesis. Yes, Eloy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, just I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking out loud.
Okay, I mean, I know.
Things. But I just I was enamored by the Grundrisse, the introduction of the Grundrisse, in which Marx establishes the distinction between concrete labor and abstract labor.
Okay.
Under concrete labor, which is oriented to the creation of value, use value, things that are useful for satisfying our human needs, became subsumed or replaced by abstract labor. And so abstract labor, he said, produces a new subject, a new person, is the free worker, right? And he uses in quotation marks. It's a person who is relatively free and is paid and so on and so forth, but he becomes part of a mass. He becomes an abstract person, right? So he becomes a body without organs. And so that process of subsumption within the subsumption of capital, of labor by capital, creates a new universal subject, a mass of worker and so on and so forth, an obedient worker. But at the same time, that worker is a body with organs as well. It's a person who produces things, even though those things are alienated from him and so on and so forth. It develops the capacity to practice, to develop consciousness and so on and so forth. And therefore, the seed for revolutionary activity emerges. And so I was trying, when I was reading this work, I was kind of imagining, trying to do analogies between the incorporation of the worker by capital under abstract labor, and the subjection, the creation of a new subject as subjected to capital and so on and so forth, but at the same time, a subject that has never give up because it works and it does things of having some sort of desire for freedom and so on. And so the worker, the free worker under capitalism, embodies a contradiction, which is the need to be servant to capital, being a body without organs, being an abstract subject, abstract and replaceable subject, and at the same time a person, an individual that has the potentiality for revealing production, domination, and so on and so forth. And so I was trying just to, when I was reading that, I was thinking.
I know, I understand the line.
And so sorry. And so I was wondering, one of the questions I said, what is new in that argument, in the sense that there is a repression and so on and so forth. Eros and Civilization is about it, right? The seventh chapter of Eros and Civilization is precisely that. It's a suggestion for a revolutionary program that rescue the seeking pleasure principle that is immanent to human beings, and so I don't know if the book.
Their revolutionary program is schizoid analysis.
Yeah. So I just messed up.
It's a very different attempt, and remember this. I mean, look, it's dense and difficult, but let me just see if I can, say it this way. This is an anti-Hegelian book, right? In many ways, it is not about reconciliatory syntheses. It's not about the negation of the negation. It's not about these methodological principles of the Hegelian dialectic. It's a very different type of approach to things, right? It is very anti-Hegelian this way. It's more Spinoza than Nietzsche, and the case can be made that the Hegelian and the Marxist dialectic can capture both of those two figures in some ways, and maybe not. Does Zarathustra escape the twilight of the owl of Minerva? To put it in more poetic terms, and Spinoza's, ultimately can be captured in the Hegelian monism and the totality ultimately too, in terms of the negation of the negation over just determinate negation. So when you mention Marcuse, he is sort of both privileged here as a trailblazer, just like he is in Stiegler, but he's also being confronted for having that kind of logic. So they're trying to build a different kind of synthetic ground here, which is more connective, again, disjunctive and conjunctive. So there's different levels here. And if you want to think of this, I mean, look, I know we did some work back in the day before the pandemic, way back in the day on Heraclitus. If you want to think about this as Heraclitean change and flux, always working through something, and that cannot be made into static or be thoroughly reconciled, and that we're really in the process of active becoming, this is something that they're doing here. It's very different than a Marcuse and other, this is a different program than the Great Refusal of the 1960s, or of, the fight for Eros as the political fight. They recognize this all the way. They're French to the core. They understand the fight for Eros in a different, and very, very, probably much better than the Germans in some ways. But anyway, let's keep that in mind, because at some levels, this is an attempt to build a different kind of, I would like to speak of this, in Leibnizian terms. It's a kind of combinatory logic that's working here. It's more combinatory, a series of things. And this is something the French did, especially beginning with the symptomatology of Althusser, the deconstruction critical project of a Derrida, and now the project of difference, right? A difference in Deleuze, right? In a way, they're all kind of going their way against the traditional readings that we got out of the Frankfurt School. And we got, I'm not saying they're better or worse, but for us to understand this, where they're coming from, there are distinctions being made. So I hear what you're saying, but their revolutionary project, if you will, again, is to ask the question of why are we, so enamored, if you will, or why do we invest so much of our quote energy into being enslaved, constantly, and not, building movements against this despotic machine, this tyrannical machine, this capitalist machine? Why aren't we doing this? In a sense. I mean, if you really think about this, in a way, not one of the left's leading lights on radio or TV, the Rick Wolfs, the Cornel West, at least in the United States, ever pointed out that Joe Biden's great claim to fame is predatory lending, right? That Joe Biden, in some ways, had a background, if you will, in terms of creating the financial meltdown of 2008 and 2009. And how many people are completely, and now we have 80 million people vote for him because they think they're going to be liberated from a fascist called Donald Trump, who uses, if you looked at this, I mean, I follow this because I'm scared. You see Donald Trump's thing in Florida, direct Nazi symbols out on stage. He's using exactly the same stuff that Goebbels is using in 1932 and 33. So we have to ask this question: what again is producing this in so many ways? Yeah. So how
I don't think it's desire, though.
What's that?
I don't think that's desire. I don't think people desire to be dominated.
It is instead. Yeah. What would it be instead?
I don't know. I think it's historical amnesia, misunderstanding of how things work. I don't think people desire to be dominated. I don't know. It's something that I would like to figure out. But
okay, fair enough. I mean, I can, I hear that, but yeah, they are saying that's not really the case. But go ahead. Yes, Richard, please. Yeah.
Well, one of the ironies for me in terms of the idea of why do people enter into voluntary servitude at this political moment is that the people who invade the capital, for example, could be flying that same flag, would be very happy to, I mean, they see that they're escaping servitude, that, you know, whether it's taxation or democracy or the left or communism, you know, I mean, this is the, I think, interesting irony is that from their point of view, and I bet you this was true down in Florida this past weekend, they think of them, and to me, this is embodied within liberalism in some way, you know, this idea of economic liberalism, that the subject of liberalism precedes any kinds of civic rights and has the right to do anything against anyone, you know, so that, you know, does fascism, you know, there's one scholar, Israeli scholar, actually, I'm reading about this, you know, does fascism come from, quote unquote, the masses, the lumpen proletariat, or does it come from within liberalism, you know, within the centrists? I mean, this is the thing is, you can see the centrist forces in the United States, like a horror movie where they lock all the doors to keep out the murderer, but the murderer is inside. In other words, there's something about the very logic of liberalism which generates fascism.
Right.
And to me, one of the things I ask, you know, is, you know, again, these people are saying often that, you know, they're about freedom. You know, why does a person want socialism? You know, why does a person want to be enslaved? You know, the discourse they often use is the discourse of escaping the voluntary servitude.
Yeah.
That they see, you know, they see on the side of on the left, that we run towards the voluntary servitude of wanting, you know, some kind of social situation, and that, you know, again, whether it's Bannon or anyway, I think it's an interesting.
I just want to go back to what Eloy.
If I may, Michael, also because this links to what both Richard and Eloy were saying. Right. But one of the latest works in relation to this question, right, is the important book by Frederick Lordon, which is mistranslated. The title in English is Willing Slaves of Capital. That's right. Not the title in French. Right. But Lordon, one of the most important things he says is that it is never a question of voluntary servitude, but rather passionate servitude, right? And this links very much to what we are reading in Deleuze and Guattari. Spinoza, I mean, the book by Lordon is on Marx and Spinoza on desire, precisely. So it is this passionate servitude, whereby it's not that I really choose. I mean, even when I think I choose freely, that's the liberal trap.
Right.
I choose on the basis of what are the fear.
Yeah.
What's the author? What's the author?
Frederick Lordon.
Frederick
Lordon. It's a great book.
Philosopher Frederick Lordon. It was the outgrowth of his attempt to negotiate. He was a negotiator between the merging of two banks. So he was trying to study the desire at the negotiating table. And he went back to both Spinoza and Marx to try to understand what Bruno is speaking to, the passionate drive towards servitude and how one is situated within the employer-employee relationship. And what we would call today collective bargaining in unions, contract unionism, all these kind of things you can work with. I just want to go back to what Eloy said just for a second about the proletariat and everything that or at least in this light. the question to me is in a way, I've been around labor struggles for a long time, especially in academia, but also, looking at, many of the most of the times, most of the events of those who become aware of things, except for a very small handful, are really about just better wages and benefits. It's never about the transformation of life or the transformation of the workplace. These are not demands that come out. It's always about wages and benefits. It's never really about the transformation. In academic labor, please don't touch my pension. Please give me my little minimal cost of living arrangement, and you're going to get that from 70% that'll sign off on the contract. So the question again is one of desire, too. I mean, in a sense. And it's not a question of just consciousness, because these are people that are conscious of what's coming down, but they go through the motions. So to me, I want to read something, that they quote from Henry Miller and early on in the book. And I think this was also very important. Deleuze once said, this is Deleuze speaking about immanence. Now we only have the choice between mediocre lives and mad thinkers. This might be one way of reading this book. We have the choice, not only between reform or incremental reform, etc., but we have the choice between mediocre lives and mad thinking. And I'm using mad in a productive way. I'm not, not derogatorily in a sense, right? And so we can keep that in mind. And also about the Henry Miller too, that he has all this wonderful stuff about Henry Miller. I think it's early on in the text. I don't know if this stuck out to you, but it certainly did to me, where he talks about the notion of those that live the safe life. This is very Nietzschean. Nietzsche and Marx had one thing in common: they couldn't stand inertia. They couldn't stand inertia. They couldn't stand the sedentary, and this is again what they're really arguing against too, in a way, because this in a way is a real call, right, for a different moment in labor struggles. Anyway, I think it's very important to look at the Nietzsche Holderlin that they speak of here, and I'm trying to find, I can't remember exactly where the Henry Miller section is, but it was really wonderful about how some people are a certain way. Maybe it's in another chapter, and I was just thinking about it. I know he's cited by Mark Seam in the introduction, very interesting moment about what it means to live a full life. So in many ways, we are not able to really think through the transformation of life, in the workplace. So to me, the notion of the proletariat as the exterminating agent of capital, basically you talk to the working class most of the times, and Marcuse was this way too. What they want are just, what the capitalist wants, right? I want more money. I want another car. I want consumer goods, etc. And this was, what Kojève, basically said about the United States. It was the communist society in the worst sense. The goods are always delivered. This is interesting to my mind, in a way, because we think sometimes too literally, in these wage labor capital relations. We should be looking at this question of what do you want? What is the change of life? What is better here? In a sense, very few unions. You look at the AFL-CIO in the United States, Trumka, which has huge membership. Millions of people. There's not one statement about the environment that's progressive. Not one. When you really think about this, the teachers union, nothing about class size in an active way, or the aspects of the curriculum. It's insanity, when you really think about this. So what do we again, I think one way of reading this text too is what does capital reproduce in this reterritorialization? they're on guard against this. I think they understand this very well, as did Marcuse. By the way, Peter Bratsis and I are doing a program Friday, and then we'll send it out to everybody on Who's Afraid of Herbert Marcuse, ? About this. Matt Taibbi calling Marcuse the pseudo-intellectual, and then we're going to confront that, but we're also going to confront a lot of very lame left responses to it. So we're going to take it on Friday. So yeah, to kind of bring this back up.
Michael, I just wanted to sort of throw in here. I mean, I don't feel ready to try and expound on it much, but it just seems like what we're talking about is, another term for it might be the Gramscian, sort of the capitalist hegemony, sort of the reproduction of these structures of domination and how they're internalized within us.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point in a very basic way.
I think that to me, it seems that it's important not to get too lost in abstractions. I think that on some level, the reproduction occurs at the level of everyday life, and the way in which our choices are organized and what is actually actionable, so to speak, at the level of how, we get up every day. I get up every day, and I might be reading Marx and have a critique of, value and money. But in fact, I reproduce those categories and those relationships when I go out and buy a cup of coffee, right? So I think that there's a very deeply embedded logic through which institutions reproduce themselves. And I think that's a very, very fundamental category in Marx. Like, he's always talking about reproduction. And one of the ways it appears in Marx's work logically is that presuppositions have to be reproduced as results, and results are shown to be the presuppositions.
Very good point.
And I think that, there's been some work in sociology, Michael Buravoy, this is kind of a different field, but looking at how the shop floor itself, the experience, it's not sort of these abstract ideologies, but it's the actual encounter of the everyday material conditions, so to speak. And I think that's an important aspect to bring into all this in terms of.
There's also a book called The Production of Desire too, how desire can be produced, what you're speaking about, into the social reproduction, that's based on a kind of Gramscian Freudian synthesis. I think Richard
Lichtman.
Lichtman, right, on the production.
A former teacher of mine. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there you go. And anyway, the production of desire is very, very important here too. So I hear what you're saying, but again, on the level, this is a book on many levels of abstraction too, the Anti-Oedipus. And again, I think they still raise the question of the desiring machine. What is this thing called desire, if you will, right? To play on a jazz song, what is this thing called? Love. They're really trying to investigate this as something different, right? And something different. And they're against this institutionalization. And how do we become so institutionalized? And, this is before Dutschke talked about the long march through the institutions. And, to expand on Leonard Cohen, they sent us to 40 years of boredom, right? For changing the system from within. So this is another thing that I hope that they give us some tools, or some different level of understanding through this. And again, to me, this is an attempted connective synthesis, if you will, of some of Nietzsche's notions of power and power relations alongside what Eloy mentioned earlier, the Grundrisse in terms of its, beginnings, the introduction to political economy. All of this is operative. So yeah, I love Gramsci. I think again, another but this is on a different. This is really trying to do something differently. I think and we'll try to go there in a way. And it's a different reading too. But they're bringing in a lot of literature. Gramsci did not read Kleist against Goethe or Hölderlin against his friend Hegel in some ways, and these were not moments in history that Gramsci was particularly interested in, in a sense, or the modernism of a Beckett, right, or of an Antonin Artaud, in terms of his theater, against the Brechtian theater of objectification. So we have many levels going on here. I mean, what I like about this, and I think it played very well, and I think Bruno can, relate to this very well with the Italian left of Tronti and Negri, because they saw the unconscious as a factory, right? in a way. This is very interesting in this sense. It was no longer just this, lie on the couch, etc. And, for those of you that read Foucault, for Foucault, Freud's genius was to take the madness of the asylum and put it in one room on the couch. This was what Foucault thought Freud's great contribution was. He was this master who said, oh, come to my office, lie on the couch, and all the madness will be here, right? And said, we don't have a need for the asylum anymore. We don't have a need for the psychiatric clinics, but at that time called the asylum. And you begin to see this in, Madness and Civilization, and of course, in the beginning of the history of sexuality. So anyway, but I'm glad you bring this up, because this is all part of the tradition, going on. And there, and remember too that Guattari is actually analyzing. He's a clinician who's on the ground, right, with patients. He's working through this art brut movement. The Richard Linders, who's a German artist, by the way, who Josh is no longer. He taught at Pratt Institute for a while. Richard Linder, the boy with machine painter. So they're really dealing with clinical practice too. Fantasy, group fantasy, all these things. So they're really looking at this through clinical eyes as well as through theoretical eyes. So this is an interesting mix to my mind. And if we can read it that way, I think it's a value. That's all. I'm just trying to say I think there's value here. And
No, I want to say something.
Yeah, sure.
The way in which I ask, what is new in this? It was not with a sense of arrogance. It was really a question that I have, and that probably I will figure out on the way. But I'm excited reading all this. Just the other thing is, the idea about the working class, asking for more benefits and all that. I see that, but that is something that happens not on the whole world. It's something I think when I read a lot of the analysis on the labor movement and the decline of it and so on, I see a lot of projection from the northern, the core countries of the world system academics. I think, I come from the third world, where and I witness revolutionary activity that is still on the way in the South, and there is another mentality. I don't think the working class there, or people who are not working class, in fact, who have been subsumed capital in the rural regions, are pleasure-seeking people, trying to being dominated, but rather there are something going on different there. And I think it's important to incorporate those analyses as well into our.
I understand that very well. I understand it very well. At the same time, I think again, we live in, quote, the most brutal of advanced societies, in a way, and the problems that the United States, or the Anglo-American world and the Eurocentric world are facing right now are the results of an accelerated capitalism, right? And many, many years of that kind of domination. Whereas in Greece, the political consciousness is so much more advanced, right, than it is in the United States among the youth, the way people are able to live, certainly in Mexico, where you come from. I understand this very well. Our problem is that unfortunately, the North or the advanced countries in globalization seem to be dominating more and more day in, day out. And, we don't really see, look, it's great what's going on in Bolivia. We're not going to forgive and forget. We're going to put her in jail. This is a good sign to me. This is healthy, to my mind. But at the same time, how long will this last, right? Josefa's Bolivian. She's no longer with us. Maybe she can give us a report, but, she's off tonight, but off the screen. But anyway, I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, they're also looking, again, to go back to these levels of abstraction, these levels of abstraction that we've gotten to now, right? In a way, in a sense. And there, and as Richard's no longer here. This book, in some ways, maybe what's new for us is what role would this have in the domination of artificial intelligence? The domination of the algorithmic governmentality that we're beginning to be subjected to. I mean, Bruno doesn't like that term. I don't like it either, but it's going on every day. Is data mining all over the world, right? How does this work in terms of that? And gives us maybe some insight into the new territorial re-territorialization of capital and the new despotic machine to which we're subjected when we wake up and then we go buy good coffee at the nice cafe down the block, etc. I understand that. I make mine at home because we can't sit in cafes yet in New York. But anyway,
Michael, I just wanted to ask. I know we're way over time.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to maybe just a short comment.
Yeah,
for my own understanding. Yeah. What was Guattari and Deleuze? How were they positioned vis-a-vis May 68? How did they view 68? I think Guattari was right at the heart of it, in the center of it, wasn't he?
At the heart, yeah. They were producers in many ways.
So
Deleuze afterwards, Paris 8 was formed after the May of 68, and Deleuze went to teach there, and that was the open school. Had I had been, of age, this is where I would have gone. I would have just gone and sit in on classes. This was the place. You had Foucault. You had our friend Vorgopoulos from Greece there. Choukalas, another friend of ours from Greece. Of course, Deleuze, Foucault, many people. Jean-Marie Vincent, who wrote, by the way, the best book, Eloy, on abstract and concrete labor. Jean-Marie Vincent. It is really one of the very best. I don't know if you know him, but it's a very interesting approach to abstract labor, right?
I had the book. I met him in Paris once.
He's one of the very best books on this.
What is the name of it, sorry?
Jean-Marie Vincent. I'll show you the book in French.
He likes mustard in the salad.
Oh, yeah.
Mustard for, I think. So anyway, you going back to what you said, very involved, to put it mildly. And by the way, when Negre was put in jail, Deleuze wrote a letter, on his behalf. And, Felix, was unbelievable in terms of what he did for militants. And he was these people, look, we sit around, we're somewhat isolated and insulated by the institutions. We live in a very different period right now. But back then, in a way, these people were involved in daily struggles. They're not that they shied away from it. They were not afraid of the streets. And, there was a lot of relationships to the most militant groups of all, right? That were happening. That's a story that needs to be told ultimately. It's not told because of probably a lot of classified.
This is the book.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
So anyway, they were very active, and Deleuze, had 3 books published. 68 was very interesting. Derrida, Deleuze, had major books, and Foucault. Foucault, took over the Collège de France, 1970. He was out of town, by the way. He was not in May of 68, Foucault. But Deleuze was there, and Felix was, like I said, always on the cusp, of the movement, and very directly involved. Yeah, and really, in some ways, I think what I'd like to do is hopefully some people will read some of his later work, Molecular Revolution, because we're going to go there later. I know that people have left, and I probably didn't do a good enough job on Body without organs, but we'll get there. We'll talk about Molecular Revolution too, his later work and how this is connected to the body, without organs, as well as his work on ecology. And Deleuze then wrote many books on the regimes of madness. They actually continued this work of schizoid analysis. And in a way. And again, I want to emphasize this is not a celebration of schizophrenia. It is an attempt to really look at a symptom and the latest symptom of capital, and also that this might be one exit for us, one line of flight, as they use the language. So we'll
Right,
go back there too. Yeah, Bruno. Yeah.
Also, no, because you mentioned also Godard before, right? And I just happened to watch again the movie Tout va bien, which is made more or less the same 1973. It's about the events of 1972. So I mean, the time after 1968, where in France people might say, everything goes well. No, everything does not, right?
No,
so that's also
yeah.
I mean, it's
that was the year 73 is when Pierre Goldman was assassinated, and they bombed Sartre's apartment too. There was a concerted effort by the right wing in France to put down all kinds of stuff. We don't get bombings of Noam Chomsky's apartment or Cornel West. We're worried about Cornel West's tenure this week. This is the level we've been reduced to. Whereas in Paris during this time, Pierre Goldman, who was a very good friend and a militant and good friend of Sartre, is assassinated. What's his name? Pierre Ouveret, the worker who taught capital to the workers at the Renault factory, was assassinated. You had many of these moments in Paris, and just a few people I'm talking about. And there's a massive amount of work that goes on that we're very much, remember, the machinery in the United States was academic for the French imports. It was not the militancy of the French theory and the Italian theory. It became academic exercises. It came through the university, in a way. So deconstruction of Derrida, Lacan, all these things were not really through the streets, right, into the thing, or what they really were doing during this period. They became academic jargon machines, right, in many ways, So this is another thing that we need to, keep in mind as we move forward. But Lydia was great today, explaining drives and the pre-Oedipal formations on, what they're doing here, because they have this knowledge. I mean, it's not like these are, novices attempting to, say we're just going to trash the Oedipal myth and the Oedipal complex and, et cetera. They have a lot of logic going on here, which is part of the pre-Oedipal and maybe a different direction too of this. And we'll come back to that in terms of the psychoanalytic framework. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was great. Thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great to see you. And, we'll get there with the new Eloy.
We will get to
something happening. Yeah. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you as well. Ciao.
Ciao.